if you were to get a text from the 1900s in relation to language change, then chances are it will, in some degree, relate to some kind of social disruption. I know that's quite a wide blanket term, but I wanted to give a real sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the key events and key issues that were being raised in the 1900s that might influence texts. Now, of course, they might not, if a text is very specific to a particular topic. If it relates to a particular location, then it may be that it doesn't really relate to very many of the issues here. But these are some of the key things that were concerning aspects of society throughout the 1900s, which, if you do see and if you can comment on, may help you with an answer looking at a text from this era. Firstly, World War One. This happens between 1914 and 1918, and Philip Larkin, writing about it in the poem 1914, says, "Never such innocence, never before or since." And a key aspect of society here that changes is this sense of a loss of innocence. This is a real degree of soul searching goes on, particularly in Europe in the early 1900s. As a result of this, it's the biggest loss of life in war, and also something that is seen as pointless. Very quickly afterwards, the view emerges that this isn't kind of good or evil. The view of Britain and the empire and this all being for the good of Britain and patriotism really sort of falls apart, because essentially this is a muddy, cold war of attrition in which there's no real understanding of what the point to it was anyway. So it does change society. There's this real sense of a loss of innocence, real frustration, and particularly amongst younger people who feel sort of cheated. Big focus on class inequality and the poorer people who were more likely to be going to the front line. The idea of lions led by donkeys, which was another famous expression that was used to describe the war in which the richer upper classes were seen as the donkeys who created it, whereas the poor went to fight and die. You also, as a result of World War One, get this big growth of America. Now, America's been emerging as a superpower for a while, but World War One makes America quite well off. Because they can be involved in selling the arms. They're not affected by World War One in terms of it doesn't happen on their shores, and you get America emerging as this real superpower in terms of politics, in terms of power, but also in terms of culture. If you've seen something like The Great Gatsby in the 1920s, you get this idea of new American society, consumerism, new fashion. You see the shorter hair, the shorter skirts, slightly more androgynous look for women at the time. So you're getting a real cultural movement here emerging from America in the 20s. And also another effect of World War One is the move towards women's suffrage. Women were taking on some of the male jobs in the war, and it's going to affect society more widely. You get the movement towards women getting more votes, and I guess some of the early organised challenges to what we're seeing in the Victorian times as the traditional place of the woman at home with the family. So you get the movement of modernism here, and this is largely in fiction, but it may well bleed into some of the texts that you see in the 1900s. You get the focus of a stream of consciousness. Okay, so fiction starts to basically go into people's heads and look at how people are thinking and their thought process, rather than the very rigid, structured form, chronological of the Victorian era. Linking to that, much more focus of the mind and the unconscious mind and Freud and why we behave in the way that we do. Get a move towards technology. World War One has led to advances in technology. We get a more consumerist society emerging from America as well. You get the jazz age and the new cities and this idea of new music, new culture. But alongside that, you get the idea of the lost generation, a group of primarily men who were either killed by the war or damaged by the war. You also get a real focus here on newness, the idea of this being a new century, and a lot of kind of hope, a lot of optimism here that's emerging, which pretty much straight away then gets undermined by the Wall Street crash in the late 20s, which then leads to the Great Depression in the 1930s, leading to mass poverty increased awareness of social injustice that's been emerging, in the decades before that, and a move towards extreme politics, socialism and fascism. Communism in Russia emerging, people moving towards the extremes of politics, seeing that the system that they're in isn't working very well. Okay, you might get those more extreme ideas, that real disenfranchisement you might be seeing there as well. Possibly a focus on poverty and social injustice if we're in the 30s, which then of course leads to World War II. Churchill gives his famous "We'll fight them on the beaches" speech, and then it kind of swings back the other way. If we get into the 40s and 50s, you might get a move towards optimism and patriotism. The US and Britain, won World War II, and unlike World War One, it was seen as a fight of good against bad, and the Britain and America triumphing over the evils of Nazism. In the 1950s, there's the baby boom, so just after the war, lots of new babies being born, and Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister at the time, says you've never had it so good. Okay, so in the 1950s, there's this idea that things are getting better, there's new gadgets, there's labour-saving devices, this idea that we'll have a far a more optimistic society where we'll have a lot more leisure time. At the same time, those moves towards social justice are still present. In fact, not long after the war, we get Churchill replaced by Clement Attlee, who brings in the NHS. So those moves towards social justice don't end, and they carry on. Moving into the 50s, 60s and beyond, we get the Cold War, this central disagreement primarily between America and Russia, but more widely between capitalism and communism. And if you get a text from the 50s onwards, it may well be touching on these ideas, okay? The ideological difference between capitalism and communism, the disagreements over Germany and the shared ownership of Germany and the Berlin Wall, the Korean crisis, carrying on to this day, really, North Korea still being a communist dictatorship, South Korea not. The superpower foreign policy here, so America and Russia emerging as massive superpowers who were involved in other conflicts in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, and then more widely involved in conflicts, I guess, in things like the Olympics and in sport and in the space race and in the arms race, basically proving who is the more powerful. Okay, so it might be that this bleeds into some of the texts that you're looking at. Into the 60s, we get what's known as the swinging 60s, I guess the children of the Cold War. So we get the movement towards hippie way of life, this anti-nuclear arms, pro-peace idea. You get youth culture emerging, actors like Steve McQueen, musicians like the Beatles. You've got younger people who have their own cultural identity in a way that they didn't before, who have money in a way that they didn't before, who've got icons who are just for them. You get the space race, Neil Armstrong, obviously the first man on the moon, and a growing awareness of social justice and particularly gender imbalances. So we get the contraceptive pill more widely available in the 60s. So second wave feminism, in which women are essentially trying to reclaim their bodies and challenge the sexism that they faced previously. So if it's in the 60s, maybe the Cold War, but it may be towards towards youth culture. It may be towards sexual discrimination or sexual equality. We also get technology. Suddenly lots of people have got TVs, and that is going to affect language. People are, you get the image there, the family sitting around watching President Kennedy. This idea of the nuclear family being a key idea, but this being driven by TV. The idea that everyone has access to education, everyone has access to technology, and suddenly the news and information is for everyone. So we get a growing simplicity of style. Okay. We get, although it takes some time, in Britain, we get the reduction in RP, received pronunciation. Before this, in the 40s, 50s on TV, the assumed accent is that very, very clipped British accent. In the 60s, we get Coronation Street, northern dialects. We get sink dramas, kitchen sink dramas. Okay, so often set in council estates in the north are very, very different. So we get this growing democratisation. Suddenly, texts are written with a wider audience in mind. The idea that everyone has access to it, everyone can read it, and this is for everyone who might possibly be interested. And In the next video, we'll be looking at this. It's a text actually from the 30s, but it demonstrates, I think, a lot of these ideas in which George Orwell discusses the role of beggars in the 1930s, and has this real focus on social justice, but in a style that can be read more widely by a lot of different people.